This great Hollywood director was inspired to make movies after seeing The Godfather when he was only 15. After selling a script to Steven Spielberg, he continued working with him, writing Gremlins and The Goonies. But his career really took off when he left Macaulay Culkin Home Alone, and then dressed Robin Williams in drag for Mrs. Doubtfire. Since then, he's had enormous success directing the first 2 Harry Potter films in the amazingly profitable 7-picture franchise.
Hi, my name's Chris Columbus, and welcome to Hollywood's Best Film Directors. First got interested in movies because of comic books. I was a big fan of Marvel Comics in the 60s. It really sort of opened up this whole world for me that I'd never, you know, it was the most magical time of my life when I could get to the corner store and get the newest issue, whether it was Spider-Man or the Fantastic Four, Captain America. To me, that represented everything that was exciting about life. And it was odd because I fell in love with those artists and the way they drew and the excitement that people like Johnny Romita and Steve Ditko, the guys who were really responsible for those characters, drew these panels. And those panels, I think, were the basis in my head of filmmaking, because I then, at that time, when I was about 10 or 11, started to go to the movies quite a bit. And I would, you know, I was typically one of those kids who would sit and watch a movie 2 or 3 times on a Saturday afternoon. And I remember that specifically with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I'd never seen anything like it. It was just such a breath of fresh air. And I watched the movie over and over and over. And I just loved being in that world because it represented to me an escape from this dreary sort of factory town that I lived in a sense. You know, I lived outside of, I lived near the Warren, Youngstown area, and both of my parents were factory workers. So for me, that was my future. I had no other sort of destiny in life or choice in my life but to follow in their footsteps, which was to either work in an automotive factory or an aluminum factory. And for me, I needed to find some method of escape. So when I was 10 or 11, I really didn't know what that method of escape was until later on, as I saw more and more films and actually read more and more comic books, I suddenly became interested in my first passion, which was moving to New York City, because all of the Marvel comics were set in Manhattan, and writing and drawing for Marvel Comics. That was my goal. And I realized at the time that it was an isolated existence, drawing comic books. You're just going to be sitting in a room and working for 12 hours a day alone. And I realized I liked working with people. And when I was in high school, an issue of Time magazine came out it was just a 1-page article talking about film schools, this magical word that I had never heard before, film school. And film school, essentially, the 3 film schools they dealt with, UCLA, USC, and New York University, talked about how you can learn the art of filmmaking. And that just stuck in my head. And I realized at that moment that I wanted to go away, go to film school, and learn the so-called art of filmmaking, because I realized that it was one step removed from drawing comic books, because all of those years of reading comic books and actually drawing comic books in my basement alone really formulated my idea of how to shoot a film in pieces, and they were basically early storyboards for me. My agent said to me, as a writer, becoming a writer and having films made is probably the best way to become a director, because at the time it was inexpensive. We never had sort of this wave of independent films back in the early 80s, so I didn't realize that if I could max out my credit cards and make a film. To me, the quickest way to get into the director's chair was to continue writing screenplays. I just wanted a little more indication of... Okay. Well, Adventures in Babysitting just gave me the confidence to be back on the set again. I hadn't directed a film since I had directed my senior thesis film at NYU, and that was 1980. So this is 7 years later, and I'm thrown onto a set with major cameras, major lighting, a major cinematographer, a guy named Rick Waite, who shot 48 hours. So I had to, I mean, my first day, first day of being on the set was extremely intimidating and frightening. But once I got on the set and once the cameras started to roll, within about an hour and a half or 2 hours, I felt very secure and very comfortable, and I eased into it, and I realized this is where I really want to be. Cut. I was staying at my wife's parents' house in Chicago, and we had just had our first child, and I thought, well, I'm going to get a writing job. And I got 2 scripts from my agency from John Hughes that weekend, and I thought, a directing offer? And they said, yeah, John was wondering if you'd be interested in doing one of these 2 films. The first one I read was Home Alone, and I fell in love with it. And again, it touched on some of those themes that had been in the back of my head forever, and I thought, wow, I could do this. I could make this a really, really strong film. So I met with John, and we hit it off, and we got along really well, and he hired me to do Home Alone. So basically that was it. Home Alone was at a studio, and they were so concerned about the budget that the studio actually put the picture into turnaround, because we were $1.5 million away on the budget. And 20th Century Fox picked up the rights to Home Alone and decided to make it into a film. And the first studio where that picture existed has now, to this day, will not put any other pictures into turnaround because of the success of Home Alone. Because Home Alone was a relatively inexpensive, cheap picture for them to make. They sent it away. It ended up doing somewhere around $500 million at the box office, and so to this day, they will not put anything in turnaround.
I'd like you to meet my son. This is Chris.
Hello. I'm standing in for Jerry Mathers today.
You've also seen him as the Beaver.
Hello.
Well, Mrs. Doubtfire happened because I had finished Home Alone 2, and I needed to find another project, and I got a call from Joe Roth. Again, we were at the same studio, 20th Century Fox, and Joe said, we have the script here that Robin Williams is interested in doing, Mrs. Doubtfire. Would you like to take a look at it? So I looked at the script. The script didn't work at all. I just felt that it was not a particularly good script, and I called Joe Roth, and I said, well, here are the reasons I think this script doesn't work. And he said, well, I'd like you to meet Robin Williams and his wife, Marcia, who's producing the picture, and talk to them about it. So I met with them, and Robin was someone who when I lived in LA for that short period of time, I would go to comedy clubs every now and then. So I went to the Comedy Store a few times when he performed, and I was just blown away at his energy. He was, and what seemed to be one of the most brilliant minds I had ever sort of come across in terms of comedy. He was able to, as we've all seen year after year after year, he just goes from one subject to the other, and it's just this manic sort of intensity. And when he was in his 30s, I think I probably saw him when he was about 31, 32, it was like this ball of fire and energy on stage, and it was really impressive. And then I saw his performance in Good Morning Vietnam, which I just thought was one of that year's great performances. So at that point, I really always wanted to work with him. So to get to meet him in person was an amazing experience, and what was even better was the fact that we agreed on where the script should go. So they said to me in the meeting, well, why don't you rewrite the script? And then they weren't committed to doing the movie yet. So I spent about 3 or 4 months rewriting the script for Mrs. Doubtfire, sent it to the studio, and sent it to Robin and Marcia. And I got a call from Robin a few days later saying, you wrote a wonderful script, I'd love to do the movie. I had seen Macaulay Culkin in Uncle Buck, and I thought he was an incredibly charming kid. But again, my directorial ego got in the way, and I thought, well, I would like to see some other kids. John Hughes said, well, this kid is really good. So I met Macaulay Culkin in New York, and I was completely charmed by it. I thought he was fantastic. But I still wanted to see other kids. So I went into casting sessions in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and saw maybe 400 or 500 other kids. Not one kid was even close. So John Hughes knew it all along. And I went back and I said, well, I've looked at everyone, and he truly is the best. He's the most unique. He's not one of these he was not at the time, one of these sort of picture-perfect 10-year-old kids with perfect hair, perfect teeth, his ear was a little crooked, and he had an instant relatability to every other kid in the audience. And he was funny. He just was something about that kid, particularly when the cameras were rolling and when you saw him on film, cameras loved him, and he was just immensely funny and talented. So we went with Macaulay Culkin, and I never in a million years thought that I would get one of my heroes, Joe Pesci, to do this sort of broadly comedic role, and he decided to do the picture, and Dan Stern did the film, and so that group of casting then gave me enough confidence with those 3 cast members to go after people who were true heroes. For me, as I was growing up, I was a big fan of Second City TV, so I wanted Catherine O'Hara to play the mom. One of my favorite films to this day is a picture called Cutter's Way, with John Hurt, and I wanted to work with John Hurt because I thought that was still one of the great ignored performances in cinema history. So I got John Hurt to do the film, and it was just great to be able to work with a lot of people I had always dreamed of working with and who were open and sort of willing to do the picture.
Me and Chris decided that we would use a dolly shot.
Yeah, what should I do here?
Do a dolly shot.
You think so?
Yeah.
Biggest challenge we had in doing Sorcerer's Stone, the first Harry Potter movie, was the casting of Harry Potter. We saw tapes of 5,000 people, so and we just never were able to find the right Harry Potter. Now, I saw a videotape of David Copperfield, which is a BBC series that Dan Radcliffe had made, and on my first day of casting, I showed the casting director. I said, "This is the guy. This guy is amazing." And she said, "You're never going to get him because his parents don't want him to be an actor." I said, what do you mean his parents? He's done this. She goes, "No, they want him to concentrate on his schoolwork. They do not want the sort of attention he's going to get by doing Harry Potter." So after weeks and weeks of frustrating, meetings with other kids and seeing tapes from all over this country and Russia and everywhere, Harry Potters from all over the world, the casting director said to me, "I'm frustrated with you. I don't know what you want." And I picked up the tape and I said, "This is what I want. This is who I want, this kid." So we forgot, she said, "Well, again, you're never going to get him. Forget about it. Put him out of your head." Our producer at the time and our screenwriter went to the theater 2 nights later, and they were sitting behind the kid. Dan Radcliffe was at the theater with his father. So David Heyman said to Steve Kloves, he goes, "Let's go talk to them." So David broke the ice, mentioned that I was obsessed with the kid, and we brought in Dan for his first interview, and slowly but surely his parents agreed to let him do the movie. So I think that was the most important decision I made on that movie, was getting Dan to do the movie. And also the other cast members. For me, seeing that all of this cast, these kids have aged so beautifully, it's amazing to me. It's kind of shocking, and this was not something I could predict. But the fact that these kids have aged so well and continue to perform so well, I mean, you've seen it. We've all seen it in the past. You get these kids who are adorable, and they suddenly age into not very attractive actors or not very good actors. These kids have just gotten better.
Action!
I never knew that Robin would take it as far as he did in terms of comedy. I always thought that, because we agreed in pre-production and during rehearsals, that he said, "I will give you, as a director, the scripted version of the movie. We'll do 2 or 3 of those." And then he said, "Then I'd like to play." He just called it playing a little bit. Well, that playing, I became obsessed with, because that's where some of the most brilliant moments of the film happen. When he started to, as he said, play. When he started to improvise, it was magical at times. Now, granted, every scene took anywhere from 15 to 22 takes, because he had this urge to get it out of his system. He had to get these things out of his head. And that's why we had so many versions of the movie. So tonally, it was very difficult as a director to stay in the tone of what the movie was. So these other versions of the film don't particularly work, because they are essentially all over the place. Here, what you see in the final film now is a combination of the scripted film and the moments that Robin stayed within character in terms of improvisation. So it was a very difficult editing task, I have to say. It was like editing a documentary. There's a moment in the restaurant, he decided his teeth were going to fall out into a water glass, and he starts digging for the teeth, and the way he started going for these teeth, and the way he started to improvise completely took the other actors all off guard. And I had several cameras, so what you're seeing are their reactions, and basically mirroring the crew's reactions of shock when that happened. He didn't tell any of us he was going to do that. So to see that happen and to get these honest reactions from people like Pierce Brosnan and Sally Field, it's just remarkable, because you never had any concept of where he was going. You just never knew. Because of my relationship with Steven Spielberg on Gremlins, because we had such a great working relationship, he was responsible for my next 2 films. One was called Goonies, which was just based on an idea that Steven had. So I wrote Goonies for Steven, and then I wrote an idea that I had called Young Sherlock Holmes for Steven as well. So we spent probably a year and a half, 2 years working together on those 3 films. And then he asked me to do a version of the 3rd Indiana Jones film. So that was a big, big step for me as a writer, and I agreed to do it. And he said, well, why don't you go? He goes, I'm going to be in New York, and George Lucas is going to be in New York at the same time, so why don't you come and meet with us, and we'll meet every day and talk about the story, and then you can go off and write the screenplay. So I thought, well, what a terrific idea, and I got to this hotel, and I walk in, and Steven Spielberg is there, and I had known Steven pretty well, but I was still very intimidated by him. And George Lucas is there, who I'd never met, who I was extremely intimidated by. So I'm sitting there in this room with 2 of my cinematic heroes, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who started talking about this idea for this Indiana Jones film. So I took, I basically worked as a secretary for 5 days. We sat in this hotel room for 5 days, and I wrote down everything they said, pieces of dialogue, action, and George basically dictated the entire screenplay. So I went home, and I thought, I was frozen with fear. I thought, I cannot change a word of this. I have to write exactly what they said. So I ignored everything I had learned in film school, everything every great teacher had ever taught me. I basically sat there and worked as a secretary. I wrote down exactly what George and Steven had dictated and turned in a script that was completely lifeless and without energy and without anything of myself, which I assume now, years later, I assume that's why they hired me, because they wanted me to bring something of myself, but I was petrified. So I handed the script in and I was fired. And it was really a defining moment for me, because I realized I will never do another project where I ignore my basic sort of intentions and instincts about this picture. It's a great example for any kid starting out today. Always listen to your own instincts. You can never be intimidated by the people you work with.
Okay, that's where you gotta turn on him, okay? That's where you're looking away, but you gotta turn on him. It's King Stanislaus' daughter, isn't it?
It's King Stanislaus' daughter, isn't it?
You're madly in love with her.
You're madly in love with her.
9 months was an extension of the fact that I had a couple of kids at the time, and I wanted to tell the world how great it was to be a father. Stepmom was a reaction to my own, losing my own mother. Harry Potter was a reaction of my daughter, who was always having trouble in school reading, could never really connect with any books that she was given. Suddenly discovered this book called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and she read it in 2 days. And suddenly she discovered the world of reading and how great reading was. So she read the first 2 Harry Potter books, Sorcerer's Stone and Chamber of Secrets, and she said to me, Dad, you've got to make a movie out of these. And I thought, okay, that sounds like a great idea. Let me call and let me read the books. I fell in love with the books, and I called my agent, and my agent said, well, you and about 50 other directors want to make a movie out of this. So they said Warner Brothers would be happy to sit down with you and meet with you and hear your thoughts about the movie. So I thought, I need them to understand that I'm really obsessed with making this movie. I want to do this movie more than anything else. So as a result, I said to my agent, get me the last meeting. She said, what do you mean the last meeting? I said, they're going to meet all these other directors. I said, so let them meet all these other directors. I want to be the last one in the door. So she said, okay. So she called Warner Brothers and set up my meeting for 10 days from the day that I talked to her. So every night until about 2 or 3 a.m., I took the script of Harry Potter and I essentially rewrote it. I rewrote my version of what it would be. Now, this was a really good script, by the way, that Steve Kloves had done. Fantastic script, but I wanted to spend some more time talking about what the movie would look like and the visuals, so I spent 10 days rewriting that script, and I went into that meeting and I said, look, I've rewritten the script for free, just to give you an idea of what my directorial vision of this movie would be. And that seemed to make an impression on them, the fact that, because no one does anything for free in Hollywood, they have to be paid for everything. And the fact that I actually sat down, wrote the script without any commitment from them, knowing that 25 other directors were interested in the project, made a big difference. I went back for subsequent meetings, and then I got the call about 5 weeks later that I got the job.
Right?
I was always a big fan of the James Bond films, and I remember being crushed when he didn't originally get the role of James Bond. He was offered the role of James Bond when he was doing Remington Steele. They wouldn't let him out of his contract. And so Pierce, at this point, and back in '93, this was pre-James Bond for him. So he came in and he was willing to do this sort of small supporting role, and I'd always thought he was a phenomenal actor. So I remember being on the set with him talking about the fact that he would be an amazing James Bond. I would just love the fact if he would someday get back to it. He thought, well, it's never going to happen now. It was that ship had sort of passed him by. And about 2 years later, I got a call from the head of MGM who said, we're thinking of, you know, casting someone new in the role of James Bond. Here are the choices. Who would you recommend? He named 2 other actors, and he said Pierce Brosnan. And I said, you've got to hire Pierce Brosnan. He'd be amazing. So I feel that that's part of my, again, little contribution to the James Bond saga, that I really, really wanted Pierce to do that movie.
Action!
Because of the success of Harry Potter, afforded me the ability to, when I came back to the States, to really find a movie that I was obsessed with. Ever since I first saw Rent, it was a musical that I wanted to bring to the screen, because again, it mirrored that time when I lived in Manhattan, and I lived in a loft on 26th Street back in the early 80s, when 26th Street was just not a particularly great area. And I remember living in that loft and throwing my key down to my girlfriend, who eventually became my wife. So it was very personal for me. And that story, living in New York in the 80s, at that time when I was there, it was a very personal story for me. I really related to Mark, the filmmaker in Rent. And I had heard that Rent was about to go to NBC to become a TV sort of musical for television, and I just immediately put a stop to it, because I had to do the movie I had to do the musical as a movie, as a piece of cinema. So I met with Jonathan Larson's parents and his sister Julie Larson, and I explained my vision for the movie, and they responded to it. And Joe Roth, again, my savior back on the Home Alone days, loved the play as well, and realized that it would be great to make it into a movie. Also supported my decision to hire all the original cast members, which I thought, I just wanted to preserve that moment when I first saw the play with the original cast members on film for everyone else to see forever. And I made the film, and I remember screening it for the first time, and people were just crying at the end of it, and they loved the film. And I realized, well, this subject matter and this world is not, first of all, critics aren't going to think it's very relevant today. It's sort of like a time capsule. And I don't know how many kids are going to go see it in the middle of the country once they realize what the film is about. But for me, it was a very important film. And it's my favorite film. Of all the films I've made, I think it just has the most passion and the most emotional power, and I love it. Movies for adults, I think, there are still great movies. You know, you can say that Sideways was a 70s movie, right? I mean, Sideways could have been made in 1975 or 1976. We do have great movies being made, but now we have a bigger genre of movies. So when people harp about the fact that nobody goes to see small movies anymore, well, there's still an audience for them. You can still see them. You can still get to your theater and see them. There just happens to be a lot of big movies that are being made, but that makes it exciting. It makes it a very exciting time. Great comedy or great drama is made because someone is really completely passionate and obsessed by it. If you are obsessed by that idea and passionate about that idea, the film will be a good film. I really appreciate any great sort of filmmaking, and for me, great filmmaking can be something that is very esoteric, or something on the level of Martin Scorsese, which is all about, for me, the visual side of filmmaking, or more about the storytelling side of filmmaking, which is someone like John Ford or Frank Capra. And when you develop a hunger for it, as I started to learn more and more about directors, I felt I had to see everything. And I still feel that way, that if there's something great out there, I want to see it. And there are so many films that I still haven't seen that I'm really anxious to see before I go find my great reward somewhere.